Personally, I think it's really important to understand that fresh fish shouldn't smell fishy. That's the kind of the baseline. So I'm not going to say that all wild caught seafood is bad, but I'm definitely not going to condone for my family blindly buying wild caught seafood and thinking that it's great because of the mystique. I know better. If you have data, you can look at a piece of fish in the same way that you might look at a supplement and say, with one serving, I'm going to get X milligrams of omega 3s. And that's really powerful. We have to think very, very differently about how we source things. If we think about food as medicine, it should be less about how much is it per pound to how much is it per milligram of nutrient per serving. And when we think about it that way, you start asking different questions.
Welcome to Dive into Health MD, the podcast where we explore how everyday habits shape your physical, cognitive, and financial well-being. Through conversations with physicians, scientists, and farmers, we explore how daily choices like food, movement, sleep, and mindset shape the health and life we experience, with special episodes on sourcing high-quality food ingredients. We do our best to stay up to date, and we're always open to refining our thinking as new knowledge emerges. I'm your host, Dr. Akshita Mehta. Let's dive in. Today, we have one of my favorite episodes to date, featuring James Arthur Smith, founder and CEO of Seatopia, a company redefining how we source and think about clean, sustainable seafood. My key takeaways are: number one, smell. Fish should absolutely not smell fishy, a marker of oxidation. Number two, texture. Fish meat, more so than others, is delicate, and mushy fish is a sign of mishandling along the supply chain. Meat should be firm. Number three, choose frozen. Fresh fish on market has been thawed for an unknown period of time, so look for frozen and thaw yourself in the fridge for 24 hours if possible. Number four, wild versus farmed isn't good or bad, but it depends on what the fish ate and the environment. We'll explain this in the episode. Number five, if eating wild, choose smaller species to avoid mercury risk from biomagnification. A better option may be regenerative aquaculture farmed fish if that's in your budget. Number six, lab testing seems to be a strange necessity today when it comes to food to prove both what's in it and what's not in it. So look for third-party testing. If after this episode you're interested in trying Seatopia, listeners are welcome to use my code DIVEINTOHEALTH to give you a discount and support our research. Let's get started.
So it's one thing for a farmer to say, hey, my meat tastes better, has better texture, smells better. A lot of that becomes qualitative, but quantitative data on how many milligrams of riboflavin, B2 per serving, or what are the specific nutrients that are associated with the health benefits, and what are the levels, and comparing that from one farming practice, one source, one farm to another.
That was a huge component of where I want to take this. And a big component of why I've been so interested in talking to you guys. A couple of the other companies I'm involving are doing lab testing on their meat and on their products, and really seeing that difference. And inherently, it does make sense. Something grown even hydroponically versus something in soil versus something grown in terms of an animal under certain welfare conditions and with certain diets. By common sense, you understand that end product may be a little bit different, but to really actually show that makes a huge difference. And a big part of my audience is physicians, and we're so data driven, and I think many other people are too. But it's really tough, even for me at first, for someone to say, hey, this chicken product is superior. It doesn't really mean anything to me. How do you know? And by what extent? And the missing link now is we don't really know exactly if we eat a higher quality nutritional product, how significantly that correlates with human nutrition. Again, I think there's some common sense behind that. But we do see the reverse. We see poor dietary habits correlate with significant human disease. And a big part of what I wanted to do was lab testing, and lab testing as much as we can. Some of the produce that we get in the grocery store, it doesn't taste like anything. It's almost tasteless. And there's some general thought that the nutritional value there is diminished. So I would love to be able to test that. Lab testing is a huge part of what I think actually drives change here.
Yeah, we've been working with a number of different laboratories over the years. Oftentimes, they're really just businesses that
Yeah.
have a business that does lab testing, I want you to talk to Eric because he got into the business from the mission side of things, really to focus on providing this solution for exactly what we're talking about. How do we quantify the healthiest farming practices to produce the healthiest foods, to create the financial incentives to change our food system for the sake of human health?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it'd be really cool to answer this other question of how far do people have to go? It's inconvenient in some ways, in a lot of ways, to buy healthy food. It's also super expensive.
Yeah,
And
you have to be
part of,
Sherlock Holmes.
yeah, exactly. And so part of what I want to try and emphasize is I don't want people to be perfect or feel like they have to be perfect, right? But if you can pick a couple of like the major food groups, the things that you eat a ton of, and try and combat chronic inflammation that way, that'll probably at least go a long way. And there's probably going to be people on all sides of the spectrum that want to clean out every single aspect of every ingredient that they could put in their bodies. And then some where it's just a lot more practical to focus on one or two things. But where is that effort have diminished value? If it takes me an hour and a half to find a farmer's market, and that's a significant portion of my day, at what point
Yeah.
is it worth it to do it? But if I can get Seatopia delivered to my house, and I can get chicken delivered to my house, and I can get some other things delivered, it's okay to go to the grocery store for maybe my lettuce or something.
Yeah.
And a little bit like the practicality side of it, I think has to go into it. I don't want this to come across as so tone deaf that I don't understand how impractical this might be for some people.
Yeah. Yeah. It's tricky because this whole industrialized food system that is part of the problem was created for convenience, right? It started with like, how do we help moms, busy moms trying to feed their families while dad's at work, and frozen dinners? But it becomes a slippery slope when the ingredients going into that are increasingly depleted of nutrients or fortified with chemicals. I think it would be good to ask the questions of what food systems have not only inherently more nutrition based on specific farming practices, but also are potentially more toxic, right? What plants or animals are grown or raised in environments that often have chemicals, pesticides, or preventative antibiotic abuse that you probably should be avoiding. And if you identify what are those items, then maybe you could say, hey, I'm going to avoid non-organic raspberries or strawberries or something that's notorious because they're very difficult to grow without pesticides. But I'm okay with certain things, like maybe it's a banana that has a protective layer and is a little bit more resilient. What are those things? And then with fish, for example, we feel it's really important because I want to be able to feed my family without concerns of the toxins that have now become so prevalent in the environment where wild-caught seafood was historically sourced from, with microplastics and mercury levels up hundreds of percentage points. We have to think very, very differently about how we source things, and we have to go the extra mile because of the environment. It is a reaction to the environment, not just the farming practices. But then when you get into farming, how is it farmed? And that's the other complicated part with seafood, is that there's not enough transparency in most of the supply chain on what's in the feed. And if they're just being fed corn and soy, you're just feeding yourself a fish that has omega 6s and 9s. What you really want are the omega 3s, the EPA and DHA. The thing that's so confusing for most people is omegas, and it's too generalized, right? To say that one fish has more omegas than another without asking what type of omegas, like the 3s, the 6s, the 9s, doesn't give nuance to, are you feeding them canola oil and rapeseed oil, or are you feeding them microalgae that actually has the DHA and EPA your body needs?
Yeah. Yeah. But it matters what kind, where it comes from, where it's sourced from, and then how it ultimately ends up in us. So every step of that process matters. When the whole point of the Docuseries is first talk about where a food comes from and how different ingredients could differ, how two different fish are different from each other. and then talk about how people can choose a healthier option, what they can look for. And then ultimately, how do you eat it? How can you cook it? What are things that we're doing even when we get that healthy product that are either enhancing or diminishing that nutritional value? And then ultimately, when it ends up on our plate, to talk about consumption and digestion and how that's a parasympathetic response in terms of our digestive process. We need to sit down. It's helpful to be around others so we can slow down, we can chew our food. So we can either start off with a really good or poor ingredient. We can then cook it in a way that either enhances it or diminishes it. And then we can either eat it in a way that allows us to absorb that nutrition or not. So each of those steps along the way results in the end outcome of what our body's absorbing. And so they're all important. You can start with a really high quality honey product, but if you pour it in boiling water with your tea and you denature all those enzymes, you're not getting it. So you can put a lot of effort into one of these 3 steps, but unless all 3 kind of come together, then you're not benefiting from it. Even if a physician has a salad or something beneficial, whatever you want to call that, for lunch, but then they're eating in between patients and they're running around and they're super stressed out and they're writing notes, our body isn't meant to digest during those times, right? And so breaking it all down and finding a way, because I think there's probably so many parts along this process of where people are not ultimately getting the nutrition.
It's so complicated and confusing. Like you said, it feels daunting. If you really want to get into it, like what is the most important things and where are the diminishing returns when you have a finite amount of time that you in brain space and energy to decide how do you improve your health or mitigate exposure to risks. And nutrition is one thing, food is one thing, that pausing to eat is one thing, stress. Yeah, it is a funny thing that so much of society now, the pendulum has swung so far. It does feel like detective work and unwinding because we need to swing back to something that allows us to be more in balance with nature. Yeah. I do want to comment one thing though on seafood, which I was just thinking about too, which is like everything that you were talking about as far as like slowing down to eat, stress, toxicity exposure. With a lot of fish, it's very different than most other things that we eat because a lot of the fish that we like to eat are carnivorous and they're eating multiple other animals that were also carnivorous. So you get a biomagnification. There's very few other types of food that we eat today that has that trophic biomagnification, which is why seafood becomes such a risk, right? What other animal are we regularly eating that ate other animals? In most agricultural systems, there's not a lot of that. Biomagnification becomes a very significant concern. And it's the reason why when you look at the top of the food chain organisms, you have these outliers of toxicity exposure through biomagnification. It does take additional sort of caution or precaution to think about what did I eat and what did it eat? And what did it eat? Like you have all these different layers. And to your point, how was the experience for that? Was it living in a stressed out environment? And was what it ate toxic or stressed out? And so we have these sort of layers of complication in our food system. It feels in some ways simpler just to be directly connected to your farmer, but most people are not. We just don't have that today. So much of society, it seems, is overwhelmed by these things that it's very easy just to be complacent and not ask more questions and just trust the brand that has the bright colors and lots of marketing, right? But a lot of the industrialized food brands have played off of that. They've really counted on the naivete of consumers' trust to say that food coloring is safe and to say that just feeding people GMO corn in so many different facets of our diet is balanced and healthy, and it's in excess and it's not giving us a healthy microbiome, a healthy immune system. It's giving us a very one-sided sort of, frankly, sugar and fat. It's not enough.
Yeah, and it's impressive how quickly the way that we eat changed once processed food and convenience food and packaged foods hit the market, and there was just an easier, faster way to do things. But I think the optimistic part, which is really what I want to emphasize with all this, is people are interested and people want to make good food decisions. And it's so heartbreaking, I think, when people are out there trying to do the right thing. They're trying to make healthier decisions. They're taking all this effort, but food regulation labeling isn't really a thing very much in this country. And even when it is, it's not well enforced. And just like you're saying, it's really easy to take advantage of the consumer. It's really easy to market something on a package that has no backing to it, or is just unfortunately just plain false or unethical. So there's really no good way for the consumer to know what's in their food unless they get to know the farmer and like actually know where this stuff is coming from. But
even then, it might just be qualitative and surface level. So that's where lab testing comes back in again. Like we're in this funny point in history where we can't trust labels and we can't trust even just looking at farms. You got to actually lab test it to see. I went to a farm recently that was doing everything right. A beautiful shrimp farm, raising fish or shrimp in a sustainable manner with a sustainable feed in a beautiful environment. But if you zoomed out just a little bit, and I had seen the photos, been in correspondence with them, when I finally went and visited, upon driving up, the red flag that I didn't see in the photos was their neighbors were a cornfield and a cornfield that was spraying pesticides, and on the other side was a municipal dump.
Jeez.
So what is going to be in the air? What's going to be like filtering in? What's going to be in the groundwater? These things are complicated. And the reality is that farm was there before those other businesses, I guess you could call them, set up. And it's a shame. It's like you can't just, it's not just what you're doing on that farm that matters, it also matters like what's in the groundwater, who are your neighbors, what's in the air. And the only way to know is to test the product.
Yeah, man. Did you end up testing that shrimp?
So, because upon further research, it's not just traditional like glyphosate that would have been tested that we need to test for. It's actually on a part of here in Kauai where I'm at, that cornfield is actually owned by a chemical plant that tests novel. It used to be called Monsanto, and now it's called Bayer or something else, but it's actually, they're testing new and novel pesticides, so you wouldn't even know what chemicals to test for. Like you could test for glyphosate, but they're not using glyphosate anymore. Now they're actually testing, experimenting with new ones. So when we go to a laboratory, we have to tell them what to test for, right? And hey, test if there's XYZ antibiotics or XYZ chemicals or pesticides, or they'll sometimes have a recommendation. But if there's some new ingredients or new antibiotics or new chemicals that weren't on the known search, it's not going to show up.
Yeah.
So it's tricky. It's tricky. We just had to pass with that one, unfortunately.
Yeah, man. But that's how much due diligence it takes, really, right? Like actually going to these places and seeing and getting a look at it.
Yeah, zooming in and then zooming out. Yeah, the macro and the micro.
Yeah. You mentioned, I think last time, that there was something that was commonly done to shrimp on the market.
Yeah, there's certain sulfates that are oftentimes added after the shrimp are harvested that allow the shrimp, once they're sitting in a slurry ice bath, to absorb water. And this sort of sulfate chemical mixture can enable the shrimp to absorb upwards of like 15% more water. And a lot of consumers actually like the texture of shrimp that have been soaked in this chemical that allows it to absorb more water. They're plumper and crispier. But that chemical is oftentimes what people have a adverse reaction to. A lot of people who say, oh, they have a shellfish allergy, they've just not had shrimp that isn't soaked in these chemicals, because those chemicals are ubiquitous in a lot of shrimp from around the world, both farmed and wild. They can increase their weight by 15% or sometimes even more. Buying on a price per pound is not always what you really want to do. You want a price per clean milligram of nutrients. That's really what we should be thinking about. If we think about food as medicine, it should be less about how much is it per pound to how much is it per nutrient, per milligram of nutrient per serving. And when we think about it that way, you start asking different questions. It's not just how big is it, but what's in it.
Yeah.
And what's not in it also matters.
That's awesome. I feel like that's a really good segue. Just if you could tell me about fish in general, where it comes from, what are different farming methods? If someone's going to a market, what are some things that they'll see?
If you go into the market, one of the first things that you'll notice is the way it smells, right? If you smell fishiness, what is that? That smell of fishiness is the oxidation of fragile long chain fatty acids. And those fatty acids, those omega-3 fatty acids, are relatively fragile. Those long chain fatty acids can oxidize very easily, and that's what makes it start to smell. But when you're in the ocean, it doesn't smell. The ocean smells like the ocean. When you catch a fish, it smells like its environment, its terroir, just like grapes smell like the terroir that they're grown in. Fish smell like the minerality of the environment. They start to oxidize and smell fishy as they're going bad. So if fish in the market smells fishy, pause and reconsider what's actually happening there. Secondly, because it is so fragile and it goes bad much quicker than red meat, for example, it is more difficult to transport logistically. What happens is a lot of fish from around the world will be presented fresh, but may have been frozen previously. And if it didn't sell when it was initially fresh, they might refreeze it. They might save it for next week or next month and put another and refresh it later. And the refreshing process is what has given frozen seafood, or a lot of seafood in general, the perception of being mushy and smelly. Fish, for the most part, have this beautiful texture when they're actually fresh, that is firm, but when you slice it with a really sharp knife, you can feel the connective tissue break. It goes through. You have these beautiful little muscle fibers. All of those break and get soft and mushy if fish is not frozen properly and not defrosted properly. Because ice crystals, the amount of water that's in a fish by its nature, by its environment, is more than the amount of water that's in a piece of red meat. And when you freeze it, if you freeze it slowly, you form a lot of water crystals, and those water crystals start cutting through the muscle fiber. And if you defrost it quickly, it creates this brittle environment. And every single time that happens, the water crystals growing and contracting and growing and contracting creates mushy fish. And water is leaching out, and then some of the nutrients are going with it, some of the oils and the fats. And so fish tends to have degrade in quality much faster than a lot of other proteins. So it's difficult to get peak freshness seafood at markets. When people go to a restaurant and they taste a beautiful piece of fish, but then they are not able to replicate that with the local market, it's generally not their fault that they're not a great chef. They're just not working with great product. Personally, I think it's really important to understand that fresh fish shouldn't smell fishy. That's the kind of the baseline. Secondly, where does it come from? The majority of seafood in the ocean is caught via methodologies that rely on technologies that were developed during World War II to find other wartime ships and submarines. So we use sonar, we use all this advanced underwater echolocation technology to find fish and encircle them with incredibly large nets. Like today's industrial wild capture fisheries have sometimes 50-mile long lines or 5-mile long purse seines that they can wrap around entire schools of fish and then encircle and close at the bottom. They're very effective at finding and catching large quantities of fish. So effective that since 2002, the gross capture on the whole planet plateaued. We have not seen an increase in production on the planet since 2002, which it's actually been decreasing. And that is assumed because we've already found every fishery on the planet. We're not going to find a new ocean with an untapped resource. The last frontier is catching the smallest creatures in the ocean, like krill in the Antarctic, which is very, I think, foolhardy and dangerous because so much of the planet's ecosystems are dependent on the base food chain, the trophic, low trophic krill. I mean, you're talking about whales and penguins and birds and everything. And those creatures are migrating all around the world. So we have to be very careful with wild captured seafood because it can collapse. We've seen it's decreasing, and we've seen certain species collapse overnight because it's difficult to assess what the maximum sustainable yield is. Great examples are in California. In Monterey Bay, we had a huge industry, the largest sardine fishery industry in the world at the time. And for years and years, it supported an city and factories. And from one season to the next, it completely disappeared. Same thing in San Diego. We had a huge tuna fishery, factories, canneries, everything. And from one season to the next, it disappeared. On the East Coast, we had the same sort of story with cod. Same thing happened a half century before in Europe with cod. It's difficult for humans to regulate themselves with something that's out of sight, especially underwater when there's a lot of money to be made. So what has happened is that we catch the very last fish, we extract the last of the oil, and we don't even realize it, and then it's gone. The demand for seafood at the same time, though, has been increasing. We today have more middle class interest in seafood than ever before. There's an increasing demand for the health benefits of seafood from a growing middle class around the world. Yet we have this finite supply. So to fill the gap, it's coming from farms. A lot of farms today are producing seafood to meet the growing interest. In fact, aquaculture today is one of the fastest growing food production systems in the world because you can grow fish very efficiently, much more efficiently than possibly any other animal-based protein on the planet, perhaps even some plant-based, because if you think about it, it requires zero fresh water, zero arable land. Some species that have moderately slow metabolisms, if convert feed to protein very efficiently because they don't expend a lot of energy. In fact, most fish utilize a swim bladder to regulate their buoyancy, so they don't have to stand on their legs. They don't fight gravity. They're able to efficiently produce protein for human consumption. Now, what matters, though, is what are you feeding these fish? Because you have this rapidly growing industry, aquaculture, supplying feed to a rapidly growing consumer segment that wants seafood. So how do you feed these fish? Aquaculture cannot rely 100% on just catching wild caught fish, bait fish, krill in the ocean because you still have this finite resource. To make matters more complicated, we've increasingly put more toxicity into the ocean. Things like microplastics and mercury and PCBs and all these forever chemicals are now in the ocean, and they show up in the fish that we raise in aquaculture if you feed them just ground up bait fish. So what we feed them is important. Increasingly, there's been a transition to land-based proteins. And the most affordable land-based proteins to feed aquaculture are subsidized commodity feeds like genetically modified corn and soy. It seems like that is a decent solution to mitigate pressure on the ocean. But what is the nutritional outcome of a fish raised on something that's not actually appropriate for the species and may or may not have pesticides or other things that we don't want in it? That's where it's important to ask what's in the feed. What are we feeding fish in aquaculture today? Because if you feed them canola oil and rapeseed oil and soy, they have omegas. Sometimes I've seen studies showing that fish raised on this diet has more omegas than a wild-caught fish. But the nuance is what types of omegas, because as Americans, we're already exposed to so much corn and soy and canola oil in all the other parts of our diet that most Americans have a huge imbalance of omega 6s to omega 3s and 9s. We don't need more pro-inflammatory omega 6s in our diet. What we need is more omega 3s so that because our body can produce omega-3s, it can convert it, but it's actually not that efficient at doing it. It's much more efficient to give it exactly what it needs. So what do we feed fish to ensure that it actually has the purported benefits of being omega rich with the omega-3s that we actually want? So the omega-3s in fish come from microalgae. Invariably, it's very confusing. People think fish produce omega-3s. They don't. They get omega-3s through their diet. And all fish on the planet initially are getting their omega-3s from microalgae. The entire world depends on microalgae. If you think back about like the evolutionary biology of life on this planet coming from the ocean and single cell organisms, it makes sense. If you think about what do those microalgae use those DHA fatty acids for, synaptic connections and the way electricity can move, it's very efficient. Evolution built so much on these molecules because it allows energy to move efficiently. It's for humans, it's an essential fatty acid. We don't produce these. Our bodies have evolved a dependency on omega-3s. So our eyeballs are like pure DHA. All of the gray matter in our brains is DHA. When humans have increasing levels of EPA and DHA, undisputably, we have healthier hearts, we have better vision, we're more intelligent. Our children or our unborn children that are fed EPA, DHA rich diet have quantifiably have higher levels of IQ and even higher points when they continue to be fed throughout childhood or early development stages. It's no wonder that like mother's milk is really rich in DHA. So how do we get that into our diet? We need to put it into the fish, and just giving it more corn and soy isn't the solution. Microalgae fed fish. We can produce microalgae at a large scale through industrial fermentation, and we can produce species appropriate proteins, things like insect proteins that are actually species appropriate. And I don't actually love the idea of eating insects directly, but salmon and trout, if you've ever been fly fishing, you know that they bite at flies. It's part of their natural diet. So when you feed something that's part of their natural diet, that's appropriate for that species, that's nutrient dense, that results in quantifiably higher levels of nutrients without exposure to the toxins, we can actually produce healthy food. So that's really the beautiful solution that aquaculture can be. To say that farm fish is good or bad doesn't take into the nuance that really should be considered. Like the same thing with chicken and beef. Farmed chicken or beef is not good or bad. How is it farmed? With aquaculture, if it's farmed on a species appropriate, nutrient dense diet and from a source that's truly scalable and doesn't have exposure to those toxins, now we're talking about true solutions. If you go to your grocery store and you get seafood that is verifiably clean, low in mercury, low in exposure to other toxins like microplastics, and quantifiably higher in EPA and DHA, and has the right balance of omega-3s to omega-6s, I would say that's a beautiful superfood. Hopefully, it was also processed and presented in a timely and safe manner. We want fish to be as fresh as possible because we know that it degrades quickly. So freezing it with something like a blast freezer, a super freezer, nitrogen freezer at peak freshness allows that to happen. It minimizes the amount of crystals, it preserves the texture, it preserves all those nutrients, and allows the consumer then to choose when they're going to refresh it. And so that's what sushi chefs do. If you eat sushi at a reputable sushi bar, when they get wild king salmon or wild tuna, it's been super frozen previously. Nitrogen frozen, deep frozen, flash frozen, snap frozen, whatever you want to call it. The idea is freeze it very quickly, as low as possible, like -20, -30, so that it doesn't absorb more ice crystals, that it preserves it, and it also kills things like parasites. There is an FDA protocol that defines the temperature at which parasite eggs and living parasites will be destroyed, and that's generally defined as -20 degrees for 7 days or longer. So most reputable sushi bars apply this technique. So super freezing fish is a great way of preserving and protecting against pathogens and parasites. In a nutshell, seafood is a beautiful superfood that most of the planet evolved upon. We have these building blocks of EPA and DHA that all life on this planet evolved from, and that's why humans today are dependent on it. That's why it's called an essential fatty acid. So seafood raised on a rich diet of microalgae can be superfoods, can allow us to quantifiably live healthier, longer, be smarter. We just have to know what it ate and what it ate and what it wasn't exposed to. What's in it matters and what's not in it matters.
Yeah.
And how it was handled and what it smells like. And the cool thing is, if you feed it the right things, if you feed it a nutrient-rich diet and you handle it properly, the amazing thing is it actually tastes better. Because when you feed something just like corn and soy, it tastes like corn and soy. When you feed it what the ocean food web is built on, all of a sudden you have all those micronutrients and minerals that your body really is looking for and is used to. And all of a sudden those synaptic connections happen and you're like, oh, wow, this tastes good and it feels good and I feel satiated. And yeah, it's because we're giving our body what it needs, what it evolved to look for.
That was awesome. Yeah, I think we touched on so many different aspects there. I think just to summarize one part going back. So for someone who is totally new to this process of really taking a little bit of a deeper look at what they eat, can you quickly talk about, if they have a piece of fish on their plate, where the options are that it could have come from? So if that's farmed, wild, or regenerative aquaculture farm, right? What do those things mean? And what are some considerations for those three?
I wish it was as simple as just saying, was it one of those three? Was it farmed? Was it wild? Or was it regenerative? Because even within wild, you have a huge variety of ways in which it could have been caught. You, as an individual, can go out with one hook and one line and catch one fish at a time. You can look at it. You can say, do you want to keep this? Is it appropriate species, is it appropriate size, is it the right time of the year? You could open it up and look what's in it. You can look what's in its stomach. You can see what it was eating. You can look at the flesh and see actually if there's any visible signs of parasites. You can hold it up to light and see translucently like what's in it. You can have a certain degree of awareness if you're handling it. Okay, I'm catching it from this stream that is notorious for upstream fire retardants. The FDA has outlined there's a lot of problems now with freshwater streams because of pollution and these forever chemicals. So I'm not going to say that all wild caught seafood is bad. I'm also not going to, but I'm definitely not going to condone, for my family, blindly buying wild caught seafood and thinking that it's great because of the mystique. Like, I undoubtedly have this romanticized, deeply embedded association of wild caught seafood. It's in my history, in my culture, in my DNA. But today, I know better. I know that I can't blindly accept that all wild caught is bad. If a friend of mine catches a fish, I might, out of respect, try it, but it's not something that I condone. So that's a complicated thing to explore, but wild caught could come from large industrial scale practices, or it could come from a small commercial practice, or it can come from an individual. It could come from clean waters. It can come from dirty waters. It's complicated. If it comes from a farm, it could come from a large factory farm, or it can come from a small farm. Large factory farms are endeavoring to produce fish oftentimes as cheaply as possible, because commodity distribution of large quantities of fish enables a lot of economies of scale for their logistics, et cetera, et cetera. If the race to the bottom is making fish less expensive through industrial scale farming, oftentimes what isn't taken into consideration is the nutrients that are in the fish and how that is potentially benefiting the human or not, and externalities of like how they're raising it. Oftentimes in the ocean, a lot of externalities are hard to quantify. Are you having a negative environmental impact by doing a large monoculture in a high density environment? Because fish poop, just like cow poop in a concentrated area, is not fertilizer. It becomes toxic. Fish poop distributed with the right symbiotic partners is absolutely fertilizer, just like cow manure distributed in the right symbiotic partnership with the microbes and other organisms is fertilizer. But when you concentrate it in a monoculture, it becomes toxic because you have these imbalances of phosphorus and nitrogen and ammonia distributed and in partnership with things like shellfish and kelp and deposit feeders. It becomes this symbiotic super fertilizer for the environment. So in aquaculture, we have this thing called integrated multi-trophic aquaculture, which is just a nerdy marine biology way of saying permaculture or symbiotic relationships or growing multiple species together that co-benefit each other. So shellfish are filter feeders. They simply pull nutrients out of the water. They filter the water, and the water that comes out of them is cleaner than when it came in. So when you grow shellfish, they are cleaning the water. Millions of gallons per day can be filtered by growing shellfish. Another really beautiful regenerative system is algae, microalgae, macroalgae. They're absorbing a lot of the dissolved particulate, the phosphorus and the ammonia and the nitrogen. That's what they want. That's what they live for. And they're photosynthesizing. And when they're pulling those things out of the water, they're helping bring balance. So when you actually put those sorts of organisms in proximity and around or integrated into a salmon farm, for example, you create this symbiotic relationship between them, because fish poop becomes food and fertilizer for the kelp to grow faster, for the shellfish to grow more efficiently. And that boost of nutrients can create a really beautiful ecosystem that also benefits the larger environment. And then oftentimes when you have these sort of polyculture systems, we see an increasing level of biodiversity of other species, wild species that are in the area, and it becomes like a fish attracting device. It's like an oasis in the middle of the desert. In fact, there's places, large swaths of the ocean that we call oleotrophic, where there's not enough nutrients in the water to support species of life like kelp, for example. Kelp need to pull nutrients out of the water. And if you have super, super clear water with zero nutrients in there, which a lot of the open ocean is, which parts of the Mediterranean are, which a lot of the fjords and at the high latitudes are, there's no nutrients in the water. But then when they put a fish farm there and they start feeding the fish and the fish start pooping, you can actually grow shellfish. You can actually grow kelp because there's now a balance. And then other species start to come around and create even more biodiversity and fish attracting devices. So you can create these oases in the deserts of these oleotrophic environments. So to try to answer your question, if you have a piece of fish on your table, where could it come from? It could have come from wild capture, and you have to ask, like, how was it caught? And where was it caught? And when was it caught? Or it could have come from a farm. And if it was farmed, you want to ask, where was it farmed and who farmed it and what did they feed it and how was it harvested and when? If you can answer those questions, you can really start to make informed decisions. If you can't answer those questions, it becomes a concern, and you may be condoning something that you don't want. You might not be feeding yourself as healthily as you are. You could be just eating cornflakes, or you could be eating mercury and microplastics. It's hard to know unless you know the answers to those questions.
Yeah. What are some of the things that Seatopia looks for when partnering with farms?
We use some base level sustainability certifications to help expedite the filter. There's a lot of farms around the world that are already utilizing ASC and BAP, which are some of these third-party audited sustainability credentials. That allows us to at least have this base level of understanding of what they're not doing. Like they're not using preemptive antibiotics. They're not putting it into the feed even when the fish aren't healthy. They're not utilizing unsustainable sources of feed. There's a handful of like sustainability metrics, and some of those are helpful to accelerate our research. But then the more nuance comes in is we then take those products and we send them to laboratories that quantify things like mercury and microplastics, and we have the Seatopia standard. The Seatopia standard says the fish should not have any microplastics, and microplastics is a defined size of a particle. It's 1,000th of a millimeter. If you can find microplastics at larger than 1,000th of a millimeter, and there's defined technology and imaging technology that can identify that and also can identify the type of microplastic and the source of it. If there's any of that in there, we don't source it. And then the second thing is mercury. It shouldn't have more than 0.1 parts per million of mercury. Why? The FDA levels is actually allows more leniency, but we've said that the Seatopia standard should be safe enough for even the most risk-averse groups of individuals like pregnant women. So specifically a pregnant mom should be able to eat anything in the Seatopia catalog 7 days a week. And that goes for children, it goes for me, because I want to be able to ensure that when I'm eating my pescatarian diet or eating the way that I want to eat, eating beautiful sushi grade seafood every single day, that I'm not accumulating mercury throughout the month or the year. In fact, a lot of people come to Seatopia because they've already received their blood work and their biomarkers and they saw the elevated levels of mercury. And then by working with Seatopia with a quantifiable lower level of mercury in all of our seafood and higher levels of selenium and omega-3s, their levels of mercury are coming down quickly because seafood can be part of a really effective way of detoxifying mercury because selenium and omega-3s help your body to detoxify mercury, but you have to ensure that you're mitigating exposure to more mercury. And that's one of the things you can do with Seatopia because everything has the certificate of analysis. Nothing that meets the Seatopia standard has more than 0.1 parts per million of mercury. And then the other thing that we get out of these lab tests and nutritional data is quantifying the omega-3s, the DHA, the EPA, how many milligrams per serving of these essential nutrients, these essential fatty acids in each fish, in each product, in each farm. If you have that data, you can look at a piece of fish in the same way that you might look at a supplement and say, with one serving, I'm going to get X milligrams of omega-3s. And that's really powerful. It's very different than what you get with a lot of seafood that is at best referencing a 20-year-old generalized FDA study on what that species in general has on the nutrients. So we quantify omega-3s, selenium, zinc. When you have that data that's actually based on that farm and being done on a regular basis, you actually know what you're eating. And that allows us to put a financial reward to farms utilizing better feeds and better farming practices that will quantifiably improve nutrient density. So I would say the biggest differentiator with Seatopia and what we look for is seafood being produced with lower exposure to toxins and more nutrient density, particularly omega-3s, selenium, zinc, the nutrients that we associate with the benefits of seafood.
Yeah, that's awesome. So mercury, microplastics, the omega content, and then the selenium content. So those are like the basis of the lab analysis that you guys are doing.
Yeah, those are some of the key points. Yeah, all of that is published. If you go to the Seatopia website, you can find the certificate of analysis for every farm, for every SKU. Yeah.
That's really cool. Okay.
You can scan every product. There's a QR code that takes you to the page where all that information's at.
Yeah. So mercury is one of the things that you guys are testing for. Can you walk me through where that's coming from, why that has become such a problem with fish?
Yeah, it's interesting. We have seen levels of mercury in the ocean go up over 300% since the Industrial Revolution, primarily because of things like coal fire plants. But we also see it in brake dust and a handful of other things, but it's being released in the atmosphere. It then falls back down with rain into rivers and directly into the ocean, and then it gets consumed by zooplankton and phytoplankton because they mistake it for other elements and minerals that they're looking for. But what's interesting is what happens to that mercury is it turns into what's called methyl mercury in the ocean, and it binds into the fatty tissues. Because it binds into fat, it ends up going from one organism to the next and bioaccumulating as it goes up, biomagnifying as it goes up the trophic levels. So that if you're eating at the bottom of the trophic level, you might be getting a very small dosage at, let's say, a sardine or anchovy. But if you're eating one level up from that, like a mackerel, you could have 2x that. You would expect that it might be 2x, but that mackerel ate sardines and anchovies its entire life. And then when you go up another level to, let's just say, like an albacore, you could have 10x. And then you go up to something like a swordfish or a tuna or even like killer whales. We have the data. When a lot of these large predatory whales wash up onto beaches, the levels of mercury are so high that the animal is considered a biohazard, that you don't even want to be in close proximity to it because the levels of mercury are so high. It's a really strange time to be alive, where the blue planet, which is 70 plus 7% ocean, where all life derived from this ocean, we're at this point in history where we've put so much industrial toxins in the ocean that simply eating from the ocean today is questionable, right? Like, we raise fish oftentimes in the ocean, in open ocean aquaculture, but we don't allow them just to go forage in the ocean, because if they do, then they bioaccumulate mercury just like wild fish, and then it ends up not being at a safe level for a pregnant mama to eat. We have to then ensure that they're not eating from the wild by giving them a specific diet that was raised and grown and cleaned and produced in order to ensure that they're not bioaccumulating the toxins that are in the environment. It's such a weird point in history. It's a really strange time.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. Those were good examples of maybe the smaller fish and then the medium-sized fish and the bigger fish for people who are not aware, and why that matters. Can you tell me about salmon specifically? Why some that has grown to be either a healthier fish or one that's thought to contain less mercury levels, and things that people should know?
Salmon's a great fish, and the reason why so much of high latitude society and ecology is eating salmon is because the species goes out into the ocean. It lives this life where it's eating all these smaller organisms, and then it goes up into the rivers and doesn't eat the entire time that it's going up into the rivers. So it has to build up these crazy fat reserves. So once it's up into the rivers, it's going to go up and it's going to lay its eggs in the same place where it was born. So it could be going upstream for weeks or a month or more to find that same spot, and it's living off of those fat reserves. So you have this fish that has this beautiful concentration of fats from the ocean, from these microorganisms that have bioaccumulated omega-3s, because it is eating, let's call it crustaceans or shrimp or krill or all these other small organisms, crabs, that have astaxanthin and all these other like types of red algae and green algae that have all this omega-3s and other positive nutrients. And it accumulated all those, and now it's going to go swim a river. So when people go and catch salmon, if they catch in the ocean, it's going to be relatively fat. If they catch it when it's all the way up at the top of the stream, it might have less fat at that point. Either way, it's still like this amazing species that has been accumulating fat, being preparing for this incredible adventure. They don't eat pretty high up the food chain. They don't eat other large fish, with few exceptions. There is something called an ivory salmon. Occasionally, people will catch salmon that are pale white, and they call them ivory salmon. Those salmon happen to mostly eat other white fish as opposed to crustaceans. And sometimes they'll eat things like mackerel and whatnot, and they'll have a different flavor and definitely a different color because they're not eating the crustaceans that have the astaxanthin that turn them red. But in general, they're eating a relatively small organism. So the accumulation of mercury is very different. Also, they have higher levels of selenium, and selenium is incredibly powerful, and it allows our body to bind and detoxify mercury. So the ratio of omega-3s, selenium, and mercury is very important. If you eat salmon, you get a healthy ratio of selenium to mercury and omega-3s. If you contrast that with something like a swordfish, the swordfish has high levels of mercury and very low levels of selenium. And so when people eat a lot of swordfish, their body is not getting enough of the nutrient that allows them to efficiently detoxify. So salmon is considered a relatively low mercury risk, and communities and societies that eat a lot of salmon are not getting the same sort of mercury exposure to people who are eating a lot of swordfish or tuna. For those reasons, salmon is considered a healthier fish because it has a lot of fat. And then it also doesn't have a lot of mercury, and it has a lot of selenium. So because of those reasons, salmon is revered as a very healthy fish. That said, you have 7 different species of salmon. You've got Pacific king salmon, you've got pink salmon, silver salmon, coho salmon, chum salmon, and then you have Atlantic salmon. All those different fish eat slightly different things, have different fat concentrations, have different color and look. So you have to know what type of salmon. Like the experience that people have when they're like, oh, I had salmon and it was dry and whatever. That's not king salmon. That was probably like a pink salmon or something else. Chum salmon, silver salmon, some of those species are not as fatty as like an Atlantic salmon or a Pacific king salmon. It's worth noting, though, all species of salmon are highly threatened, if not endangered. Atlantic salmon are endangered. Very few wild Atlantic salmon left. King salmon, chum salmon, everything in the Pacific is threatened and highly protected, but we continue catching them on commercial fisheries that are highly regulated. So regulated that some years they don't even open the fishery. Like you have whole communities and industries with boats and kids and grandparents and factories and everything ready to go. And then some years they won't even allow one boat to go and catch fish because there's just not enough of them, as we think. Some years they'll open it and let them fish for a month. So if, to that point, if the entire world said, I only want to eat wild-caught salmon, we would deplete the entire species of wild-caught salmon in a month, in less than a month. We could do it in a week. There's not enough wild-caught salmon. Complicate things further, we also have issues with parasites and other toxins that are in wild salmon. So you have to know what species you're dealing with. You have to know how it was caught, and whatever species of wild salmon you're eating, you definitely don't eat it raw, fresh. Yeah, it has to be frozen. If you were in Alaska and you caught a wild salmon on the river and you brought it to shore and you said to your guide, hey, let's cut this thing open. I brought some wasabi. I want to eat it right away. He would say, stop. That's how people die. We need to freeze it or cook it because of parasites. Yeah. So that's a little bit about salmon. Salmon are amazing creatures that, that should be celebrated but respected.
Yeah, that's super, super interesting. And then can you, so for some of the farm salmon, there was something that people are adding to the feed to help with that pink coloring to almost simulate the astaxanthin. That?
Yeah, so just like wild salmon, the color of salmon is entirely dependent on what they eat. So I'm going to say that again. Wild salmon and farm salmon are the color they are depending on what they eat. Wild salmon can be pink or white or ivory or deep red. It entirely depends on what they ate. Deep red salmon ate a lot of shrimp and crabs and things that had red algae astaxanthin carotenoids, and that's what gave it its color. In farms, the same exact thing. Some farms will feed them a feed that has a lot of astaxanthin in it. That gives it that red color. So wild and farm salmon are the color they are dependent on what they ate. And astaxanthin can be produced from microalgae or it can be produced from yeast. It depends on how it was produced. If it's produced from microalgae, it has an incredible, it's like one of the highest constant sources of antioxidants that we know of on the entire planet. It's one of the healthiest supplements that humans or animals can have. I take astaxanthin. We take 2 a day and then get some additional benefits, not only of the antioxidants that protect our cells, it also protects you from the sun. It naturally helps with melanin and gives you an ability to be more sun resilient. So at any rate, yeah, astaxanthin can be produced from a number of different sources. What it's produced from is going to affect how healthy it is, the antioxidants, and whether or not it's actually helping the salmon to have a more robust immune system, or if it's just for coloring.
Okay. Yeah. So if from the yeast, then it doesn't have as many of those benefits. Is that true?
Yeah.
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 Okay. Awesome. Yeah, this was great. Is there anything else that you want people to know about consuming fish in general or food in general?
I think the other thing to think about with fish is that you are also consuming water and water crystals and water molecules and the structure of water as people as well. Like we are what, 70% water, amazingly. And the structure of the water that we're consuming has a lot to do with how we eat. You can affect the structure of water. So there's been all these beautiful studies on how water molecules react to energy, to music, to intention. And the same thing I think is true with our fish. If you're going to eat a piece of fish, please take the time to appreciate it, to acknowledge it. There's a life and a history that went into raising it, growing it, catching it, harvesting it, processing it, bringing it to you. Taking a moment to acknowledge that, perhaps even elevating it as like art, is a really beautiful and profound way to, I think, affect for a community of MDs. Think about just the chemical structure of water and how it might be more efficiently converted for your body's ability to absorb the bioavailable nutrients. And I think there's still some studies that need to be done to quantify this, but there's a lot of anecdotal photography and whatnot that has been demonstrated to show structural changes to water, and fish and humans are 70% water or more. And the way that we honor and speak to ourselves and speak to our food and acknowledge our food has an effect on 70% of us.
Awesome. Awesome. One last question.
I don't know if that's gonna resonate with your audience or not. But
I think it's great. I think a big part of this is just being a lot more intentional, right? Thinking differently about the way that we eat, and it has to start somewhere. I think that's great. One other question that's not exactly related, but you guys talk about regenerative aquaculture. Is that something that eventually could scale to meet global needs?
Can regenerative aquaculture scale to meet global needs? Absolutely. It absolutely can. It has in the past. If you think about the way in which the planet was abundant, still the oceans have the ability to be incredibly resilient. When we protect a marine protected area like Cabo Pulmo in southern Baja was completely depleted of fish to the point where the local community, who were all fishermen, all of a sudden there was no more fish left. They had no choice but to listen to this old grandma and say, let's stop fishing entirely for the next 10 years and see what happens. Let's try to do something different and protect the waters, protect it from outsiders coming in fishing, and we will also not fish it for 10 years. And what happened was it became so abundant. And during those 10 years, they started doing ecotourism, that the gross economic benefit to the community from ecotourism was greater than they ever saw fishing,
Oh, wow.
because the ocean's ability to be resilient is immense, and it has to do with those symbiotic relationships. It has to do with the three-dimensionality. It has to do with the way sunlight is photosynthesizing and going into strata of the ocean in very different ways than it does on land. We have this really unique environment in the ocean. You have interconnected currents. When we protect the ocean, we see resilience. When we create symbiotic relationships, we see abundance. When we try to do top-down approaches of monoculture farming, we run into problems. We run into disease. We run into limited resources. When we step back and say, hey, humbly, let's learn, let's observe, how did nature evolve for millions of years? What are the ecosystem services being provided by some of these other organisms that we didn't actually consider? All of a sudden, we see more resilience, more robust ecosystems. If you think about a rainforest, for example, some of the highest density of biodiversity on the planet, it's because you have so many different species that it creates a more robust ecosystem, more robust economy. And the same thing in the ocean. Think about a coral reef. It's like a high density city. You have so many different organisms that have these that have symbiotic partnerships. When we learn how to farm in that way and move away from this monoculture environment and start raising fish and shellfish and microorganisms together, we have the ability to create much more density, much more abundance, and a positive ecosystem services, positive impact on the environment, and healthier fish, cleaner environments. We can clean environments while farming. We can have a net positive impact on environments. We have absolute examples of that with some of the farms that we're working with today. There are solutions that simply need to be celebrated and scaled. And so I believe it. And there's data that shows that we could utilize less than 10% of the global coastline to produce more than 4 times what the current protein production needs are of the planet. We just need to, because we have 3 dimensions, and we have the ability to go much denser when we move into multi-trophic farming. It's just, again, we need to move away from the linear thinking that it's one species and that it's just at the surface. When we start farming not just species up here, but what do we farm on the seafloor? What do we farm in between? On the seafloor, when we have sea cucumbers that provide ecosystem services, we have sea urchins, we have crabs that have, and lobster that are eating the deposit. So we have all of these players working together to create healthy symbiotic relations and healthy ecology. So yes, the ability for regenerative systems to regenerative aquaculture to regenerate the ocean and feed the global needs is absolutely there, and is also probably the biggest lever for climate change that we have, because when these systems are healthy, they're sequestering carbon, they're cleaning the environment, and there's no larger lever for climate than the ocean. So we can catalyze these ecosystem services and create healthy ecosystems, healthy ecology. Not only can we help produce healthier food in more abundance, in more density, we can start to regrow the buffers and the carbon sinks that the ocean needs, that the ocean would create if we just get out of the way.
That's fascinating. That's really cool.
It's an optimistic look at what we can create if we get out of the scarcity mindset and really put our dollars into the demonstrated technology that's there and be more intentional about the food that we're buying. Think about how we spend money every single day. We spend a lot of money on food. It is the fuel that allows us every single day to be healthy or not. If we at least do that in balance, that we place commensurate value in the food that we do into our cars and our entertainment, perhaps we could have healthier food systems. And I think, and that's what we're doing with our household. That's what we're doing with our community. That's what we do with Seatopia. And we are affecting change.
Awesome. That's so cool. Thank you. This was really fun.
Thank you.
Yeah, great. This was super valuable.
Me too.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for facilitating this conversation. It was really nice. I appreciate your questions. I appreciate you caring about these things and bringing this message to our healthcare frontline community that really this is potential change makers.
Yeah, we really need to be talking about this stuff, I think. We really want to combat chronic disease and see less of the same things that we see over and over again every day. Then I think this is an important place to start. So thanks for giving us an option and an opportunity to eat something that's a little bit healthier for us.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Glad to be a part of this. Keep in touch. I'm glad that you guys are eating Seatopia. You're part of the community. You're voting with your fork. And yeah, looking forward to hosting you guys at one of the farms.
Thanks for tuning in to Dive into Health MD. Our goal is to empower you with knowledge to better understand how your daily choices influence your health. If you enjoyed this episode, consider sharing it and subscribing so you don't miss what's next. Please remember, this podcast is intended for educational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. Wishing you physical, cognitive, and financial wealth. See you in the next episode.